President George W. Bush likened the January 6th rioters to the 9/11 jihadists. Many applauded him, but will the U.S. government's response to January 6th match Bush's response to 9/11? Welcome to America Uncovered. I'm Chris Chappell. 20 years have passed since the terrorist attacks on September 11th, 2001, and a lot has changed since then. A new Lord of the Rings is coming out, Law & Order plays 24/7 on TV, and the Taliban rules Afghanistan. Okay, maybe not that much has changed. In response to 9/11, President George W. Bush launched the War on Terror, which included a massive domestic surveillance apparatus enabled by the Patriot Act. But has 20 years of this made the U.S. safer? According to a Washington Post ABC News poll, Americans only narrowly say the U.S. is safer from terrorism than before 9/11. The poll also found that more Americans think 9/11 changed the country for the worse than for the better. Wait, who's saying 9/11 made the country better? I guess some folks really liked freedom fries. Thanks, terrorists? Speaking of changing the country for the worse, President George W. Bush spoke over the weekend at the 9/11 Memorial in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, where he compared the September 11th attacks to the January 6th Capitol riot.
And we have seen growing evidence that the dangers to our country can come not only across borders, but from violence that gathers within. There is little cultural overlap between violent extremists abroad and violent extremists at home. But in their disdain for pluralism, in their disregard for human life, in their determination to defile national symbols, they are children of the same foul spirit, and it is our continuing duty to confront them.
January 6th was nothing like 9/11. For starters, Steve Rannazzisi didn't lie about being at the Capitol on January 6th. Yet. But Bush is hardly the first to compare January 6th to 9/11. In fact, over the past few months, there have been people who claimed the January 6th riot was worse than 9/11. Forget the death and destruction. 9/11 was objectively worse than January 6th, simply because it gave us the TSA. You know I'm right. But if we're going to look at the facts, on one hand, September 11th was the worst foreign attack on U.S. soil, killing almost 3,000 Americans and injuring more than 25,000. Al-Qaeda terrorists simultaneously hit the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and would have likely hit the U.S. Capitol building if the passengers on United Flight 93 hadn't fought back against their hijackers. Wikipedia calls it the deadliest terrorist attack in human history. On the other hand, on January 6th, a mob broke into the U.S. Capitol building to protest what they thought was election fraud. 4 protesters died, 2 from natural causes, 1 from a drug overdose, and 1 from being shot by police. 1 police officer died of natural causes, and 140 others were injured, which is terrible, but that doesn't sound any worse than a typical Walmart on Black Friday. And as we have covered in a previous episode, the FBI found that they couldn't technically classify the January 6th riots as sedition, insurrection, or domestic terrorism. It wasn't even the worst flash mob I've ever seen. So how can people compare these two events and say that the January 6th riot was worse than the deadliest terrorist attack in human history? You know, because it was more upsetting. If we're going to go by how upset we were, then to a lot of people, the Game of Thrones finale was literally worse than 9/11. Let's not get into that. Too controversial for this show. President Bush's remarks about the January 6th rioters earned the applause of many Trump critics. Washington Post columnist Jennifer Rubin said that both the 9/11 terrorists and the domestic 1/6 terrorists sought to destroy our democracy in service to a crazed ideology of intolerance. But the 1/6 terrorists breached the building the 9/11 terrorists could not. Okay, But some of the rioters weren't able to get on planes, so that point goes to the 9/11 terrorists. Former MSNBC host Keith Olbermann takes it a step further by claiming Bush now recognizes Trump, his supporters, and those who directly participated in the January 6th riots as terrorists. Which isn't saying much, since Bush has never been good at figuring out where terrorists actually come from. But Olbermann is saying not just people who stormed the Capitol building, but all Trump supporters are terrorists, apparently. Maybe that's why some conservatives worry that the ruling class, Bush, Biden, and the rest, are laying the rhetorical groundwork for launching a war on their own people. Who? This guy? Does this look like a guy who would take away the rights of American citizens because of the threat of terrorism? More after the break. Welcome back. President George W. Bush took away Americans' rights thanks to the Patriot Act. Passed just a month after the 9/11 attacks, it allowed the government to simply go to a secret court established by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act of 1978 and request permission to monitor phone calls, emails, and/or text messages. All those insane clown posse songs you've been hiding on your computer? The government knows about that. Bush's Justice Department said this was necessary because it removed major legal barriers that prevented law enforcement, intelligence, and national defense communities from coordinating their work to protect the American people. Now, police officers, FBI agents, federal prosecutors, and intelligence officials can protect our communities by connecting the dots to uncover terrorist plots before they are completed. But for some reason, this alarmed many civil liberties advocates and people with insane clown posse songs hidden on their computers. The American Civil Liberties Union warned that the Patriot Act made it easier for the government to spy on ordinary Americans by expanding the authority to monitor phone and email communications, collect bank and credit reporting records, and track the activity of innocent Americans on the internet. According to the Brennan Center for Justice, easy governmental access to the private lives of law-abiding citizens has proven to have scant national security benefit while enabling the monitoring of racial and religious minorities, protesters, and political opponents. Who would have thought that allowing the government to spy on citizens would be a bad idea? You know, besides everybody! Even the people that thought America improved after 9/11. In response to these concerns, the U.S. Freedom Act of 2015 was passed. It neutered the government's authority to collect millions of Americans' phone records in bulk. But privacy advocates say that it didn't solve the broader digital surveillance problem. For example, the 2020 version of the Patriot Act, now called the USA Freedom Reauthorization Act, still allows the FBI to collect Americans' web browsing history without a warrant. Even when you use incognito windows, the government knows what you're looking at. We all know what you're looking at. And there are concerns that the Biden administration is about to launch their own version of the Patriot Act to fight domestic extremism. This summer, the Biden administration released a plan to counter domestic terrorism. Attorney General Merrick Garland tried to reassure people by saying that they would focus on violence and not ideology, and that the government will not investigate people for their First Amendment protected activities. I feel better. It's not like the U.S. government has ever misused terrorism laws. That's why groups are urging the Biden administration to avoid flawed post-9/11 counterterrorism tactics, like the TSA. But 9/11 and the Patriot Act didn't just change government surveillance in the U.S. It affected other countries too. And there's one liberal democracy in particular that's arguably doing even more to curtail privacy rights than the U.S. I'll explain after the break. Welcome back. Before 9/11, Australia had 0 national counterterrorism laws. But after 9/11, it passed a whopping 92 counterterrorism laws. That seems excessive. Prior to and after 9/11, more Australians were killed every year by horses and ponies than by terrorists. Which means the more effective policy taking out threats to Australian lives is glue. The scope of Australia's counterterrorism laws is staggering. Australia goes all out for what's called preemption, which mirrors Bush's idea of not waiting too long for a threat to emerge. to monitor, detain, disrupt, and prosecute those considered to present a future threat. Australia's counterterrorism laws include control orders, which allow courts to impose restrictions like mandates on curfews, limits on phone or internet usage, and electronic monitoring. Even for children as young as 14, which is ridiculous. They should be monitoring kids way younger than that. Why does Jessica really want a pony for her birthday? What's that little terrorist plotting? There are also preventative detention orders, which allow police to detain people secretly for up to 2 weeks, either to prevent an attack or protect evidence relating to a recent one. And this was before COVID, which they used as an excuse to detain you in your own home. Man, Australia's always been about locking up its citizens. Why am I bringing all this up? Well, Australia recently passed a surveillance bill that lets the police take over accounts, alter, and delete data. Talk about good timing. What better way to celebrate the 20th anniversary of post-9/11 government overreach than with even more government overreach? Under this new bill, the Australian Federal Police and Australian Criminal Intelligence Commission will now have unprecedented powers to penetrate criminal networks and modify or delete harmful content, such as child exploitation material. You might think that deleting harmful content is good, but critics say this law leaves too much room for government abuse. All the police have to say is that they have reasonable grounds that a crime will likely be committed and that disrupting the data will help stop a crime from happening. It's like they saw the movie Minority Report and decided to start their own pre-crime division, but without the psychics. They don't even have Tom Cruise to use his Scientology powers. The law also allows the government to collect information from devices and networks that are used or even just likely to be used by criminals. And it allows the government to take control of online accounts to gather information, which is why it's been called the hacking bill. So in Australia, the government wouldn't just know about your secret insane clown posse songs. They'd also be able to hack into your Facebook account and sign you up for the gathering of the juggalos. That's truly terrifying government overreach. Like I said about Australia's nightmare lockdown policies, Americans can look at Australia to see what happens when the government overreaches in times of crises. What do you think? Leave your comments below. And if you like this show, please know we could not do it without direct support from viewers like you. Visit patreon.com/AmericaUncovered and contribute $1 or more per episode to help us keep the show going. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. Thanks for watching America Uncovered.